In the early days of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, the nation was almost a satellite state, overshadowed by the might of the Soviet Union. So much so that Mao Zedong, whom China revered as a fearless leader, was treated as nothing more than a puppet on Joseph Stalin's string, a humiliated figure relegated to the sidelines during his visit to Moscow in 1949. But if there's one thing that China is hell-bent on achieving, it's correcting historical humiliations and regaining its rightful place on the world stage. In the case of the Soviet Union, or now Russia, China had to wait some 70 years for the tables to turn. But boy did they turn. Now China holds the better cards in the Moscow-Beijing relationship. The country that was once China's domineering overlord has now become its lapdog, eager to please and gain favor. But how did this happen? How did the power dynamic between Beijing and Moscow shift so drastically? Stick around and you'll find out. But to understand just how drastic this power dynamic switch has been, we must first travel back in time to the previously mentioned early days of the People's Republic of China. The PRC was founded in October 1949. Just 2 months later, Mao traveled to Moscow to meet with Stalin, then the leader of the Soviet Union. This meeting was crucial for the newly established People's Republic of China, as it sought recognition and support from the Soviet Union, a major world power and the leader of the communist bloc. Now, judging by the hearty military march performed in Mao's honor on this occasion, he had nothing to worry about. After all, the opening line of Moskva-Peking, or Moscow-Beijing, a song written to celebrate China and Russia's relationship, loudly proclaimed that Russians and Chinese are brothers forever. Yet Stalin did not treat Mao as a brother. He treated him as a subordinate. For starters, he didn't even welcome him immediately. Instead, Stalin shipped Mao off to his snowbound seasonal home, located 17 miles outside of Moscow. There, he couldn't do anything but wait for Stalin while complaining about virtually everything, from the quality of the fish he was served to the discomfort of the mattress he slept on. Weeks later, when Stalin finally granted Mao an audience, he had little interest in Mao's ideas and plans for China. Instead, Stalin focused on asserting Soviet dominance and reportedly even lecturing Mao on Marxist theory. He then strong-armed his way into a highly advantageous arms deal that had China borrowing money from the Soviet Union to purchase the country's weapons. Worst of all, the borrowed money was to be paid back with hefty interest. This first meeting undoubtedly set the tone for the relationship between these two countries and their leaders for years. While Stalin was alive, he was the teacher, the titan of the communist movement, as one author puts it. Naturally, this made Mao nothing more than his student. Though to be fair, Mao did learn a thing or two from Stalin. He copied many of the Soviet leaders' ruthless tactics, consolidating his power through purges, propaganda, and authoritarian control. These two leaders had another thing in common: an ever-growing disdain for the West. That's also what kept Russia and China together throughout history, despite all their differences and conflicts. One of these differences lies in how these nations continued growing and developing after their initial alignment. China has undoubtedly done a superior job of building its economy and becoming a global powerhouse. Russia, on the other hand, hasn't, not even close. The country pursued an empire-building foreign policy that only managed to strain its resources and hinder its economic progress. Russia was no longer China's big brother, but rather a struggling neighbor, unable to match China's economic influence. But don't get it twisted, Russia was still a force to be reckoned with, far from being anyone's pet. So what brought Russia to its knees before China, transforming it into a mere shadow of its former self? The answer is simple: the war in Ukraine. After mercilessly invading Ukraine, Russia was shunned by much of the Western world. In fact, having faced a barrage of sanctions, harsh criticism in international media, and exclusion from global cultural events, it appeared Russia was all alone. But it wasn't. It still had one powerful ally left: China. Of course, this allyship would come to cost Russian President Vladimir Putin quite a lot, more than just his wounded pride. You see, Russia has become significantly dependent on China's economic, political, and technological support. In other words, China has now become the dominant partner in the relationship. The student has become the master. Let's see how Russia's dependency on China materialized. First up, Russian exports. Just a few short years ago, Russia was a major exporter of oil and gas to Europe. We're talking about a total energy export of over $150 billion. Germany alone imported about 15% of the total figure. That's roughly $23 billion in crude oil, gasoline, and diesel. However, after Putin made the disastrous decision to invade Ukraine, the relationship between Russia and Europe soured. What followed were sanctions that included restrictions on energy imports. Naturally, these restrictions drilled a huge hole in Russia's budget, a hole that forced Russia to pivot its export focus to China. Now, it's undeniable that China had previously sought new energy resources to fuel its rapid economic growth. However, with this new dynamic, something else fell into Beijing's lap: a massive leverage over Moscow. China was now in the position to decide how much it wanted to buy, thus holding the reins and exerting influence over Russia. For now, the country has been pretty generous in its dealings with Russia. We'll let the numbers speak for themselves. In 2022, crude oil imports to China reached 1.82 million barrels a day, a 42.5% increase from the 800,000 barrels Russia exported to this country in 2021. And that was just the beginning. In March 2024, this figure reached a staggering 2.55 million barrels per day, more than doubling the 2022 numbers. The fact that Russia almost exclusively counts on China to keep its oil imports afloat is bad enough. The fact that this oil is sold at a hefty discount from global benchmarks adds insult to injury. But it's not like Russia has a choice. The same can be said for Russian gas exports. China holds all the cards there as well. Shortly before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia signed a deal with China, agreeing to boost its natural gas supply to the country. In 2020, China received only 4.1 billion cubic meters of Russian gas. With this new deal, the figure was to rise to 48 billion by 2025. Around the same time, Russia started planning the construction of the Power of Siberia 2, a new 1,865-mile-long pipeline that would further increase the capacity to supply natural gas to China and deepen Russia's economic ties to the country in the process. However, oil and gas aren't the only commodities driving Russia's dependence on China. The total trade turnover between the countries has been on a steady rise since 2022. For comparison's sake, this turnover was around $107 billion in 2018. In 2022, it was $190 billion. In 2023, it was around 240, a 26% jump. In 2024, this figure might grow by another 15%. Talk about a booming relationship. Another way Russia has bowed down to China was by embracing the country's official currency, the renminbi, in several areas. One of them is the stock exchange. The Chinese currency dethroned the US dollar to become the most traded foreign currency on the Moscow Stock Exchange, with roughly 42% of transactions now conducted in the renminbi. Another is Russia's reserve currency. According to some estimates, Russia's reserves were valued at over $600 billion before the invasion. Post-invasion, half of these reserves have been immobilized in the West. A huge chunk of them has also been used to support Kremlin's war effort. In this chaos, Russia's central bank had no choice but to turn to the renminbi as its reserve currency. By now, you can clearly see a pattern of behavior. Step 1. Russia has no other viable alternatives. Step 2. Russia turns to China. Step 3. China now has major leverage over Russia. It's precisely this 1-2-3 sequence of events that has turned Russia into China's pet. Though to be fair, Russia's reliance on the renminbi can also be explained as part of the rising de-dollarization movement. Russia was joined in this movement by BRICS initial members, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, with the goal of reducing their dependency on the US dollar and ultimately diminishing Washington's economic influence. That's why Russia now uses the renminbi to settle 25% of its international trade and 75% of its dealings with China. But this doesn't change the fact that China now holds significant sway over Russia's economic decisions. The same applies to the country's military decisions. But how so? Well, the war in Ukraine has been wreaking havoc on Russia's defense capabilities. And who's been helping the country with this mess? You guessed it, China. China has been a tremendous support while Russia is ramping up its defense capabilities. So much so that Moscow is currently undertaking the most ambitious military manufacturing expansion since the Soviet era. But what exactly is China's role in all this? It's the same role China assumed for many countries worldwide. China is the supplier. As the leading supplier for the Russian military complex, China provides a significant chunk of components necessary for Russia's military production. This includes everything from machine tools to drone and turbojet engineers. It also includes nitrocellulose, which Russia's military uses to produce large quantities of artillery rounds. However, large might be an understatement, as Russia is on track to produce 3 times more artillery shells than the entire US and Europe are producing for Ukraine. Currently, the country is producing about 250,000 artillery munitions per month. If we crunch the numbers, this comes out to 3 million a year. Together, the US and Europe can only generate about 1.2 million artillery munitions to send to Ukraine. Russia is also dependent on China's microelectronics, which are used to power its advanced military systems. As many as 90% of these microelectronics were sourced from China in 2023. China is also supplying technology to Russia. After all, the country did spend years stealing Western technology through various means, so why not share the booty with its down-on-its-luck partner? Of course, China's President Xi Jinping isn't doing this from the goodness of his heart. Personal interest has fueled every single one of his actions, but more on that later. For now, let's focus on the other ways Russia has benefited from China militarily. So, China is helping Russia produce new weapons. However, it also sells sophisticated military equipment directly to Russia. However, there's an important caveat: no lethal weaponry. The US warned China against selling these types of weapons since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. It seems that China has heeded these warnings so far, well, officially at least. After all, we are dealing with two of the world's most secretive countries here. But China is sticking to the no-lethal weaponry story, so let's give it the benefit of the doubt. In February 2024, the country reaffirmed this commitment when China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke at the Munich Security Conference in Germany. According to reports, he assured his Ukrainian counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba, that Beijing isn't selling lethal weapons to Russia for its war against Ukraine. So what is China selling to Russia? Mostly military vehicles and drones. In the first year or so of the Ukrainian invasion, Russia purchased $32 million worth of Chinese drones from manufacturers like DJI Technology and Autel. In December 2023, Russia bought 500 Chinese Desert Cross 1003 all-terrain vehicles, or ATVs, manufactured by Shandong Odess Industry. Reportedly, these 500 units were added to Russia's existing lineup of about 500 basic models of this vehicle. It also plans to acquire 1,000 more of these ATVs. But the fact these aren't lethal weapons doesn't make China's dealings with Russia any less worrisome. After all, supplying components and technology for lethal weapons is almost as impactful, if not more so, in the long run. That's why the US has been taking steps to curb China's ability to supply such components to Russia. In December 2023, the US Department of Treasury sanctioned a network of entities and individuals based in China for their involvement in facilitating transactions of Chinese-manufactured weapons and technologies to Russia. The list of these sanctioned individuals and entities only keeps growing as Russia amps up its military production. Paradoxically, while supporting Russia's war effort directly and indirectly, China is also trying to assume the role of the peacemaker between the two countries. Initially, Xi's peace initiative consisted of 12 points aimed at de-escalating the conflict and finding a diplomatic solution. However, these points were vague at best and mostly served to promote China as a peace-loving global power. So it's no wonder this initiative was ill-received by both Ukraine and the West. The new 4-point peace plan from April 2024 doesn't look any more promising. According to China, this plan is no longer vague. Listen to the aforementioned principles and see whether you agree. Number 1. Focusing on peace and stability rather than selfish gains. Number 2. Cooling down the situation in Ukraine rather than adding fuel to the fire. Number 3. Establishing conditions for restoring peace rather than aggravating the situation. Number 4. Reducing the negative impact of the war on the world economy. Not exactly the Treaty of Versailles, is it? Both plans are nothing more than a clumsy way to show the world China can resolve a major conflict. Though let's be honest, these performative plans probably couldn't even resolve the conflict between two neighbors fighting over a fence. But China is probably content with how things currently stand. After all, the situation in Ukraine is what brought such a radical shift in the power dynamics between China and Russia. And let us tell you, China has gotten quite a few concessions in this ordeal. Arguably, one of the most significant concessions is access to the Arctic. You see, Russia is an Arctic nation, owning some 15,000 miles of the Arctic Ocean coastline. China, on the other hand, isn't. Well, at least territorially. In spirit, China pretty much considers itself an Arctic nation, or a near-Arctic nation, to be precise, which is what Xi proclaimed China to be in 2018. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia, which considers the Arctic its backyard, wasn't too happy about China trying to jump the fence. Though the sentiment might not have changed after the invasion, Russia no longer has the luxury of saying no to China's Arctic ambitions. After all, it was shunned there too, with the remaining Arctic nations refusing to cooperate with Russia in the Arctic Council. Let's review the 1-2-3 pattern. 1. Russia is completely isolated. 2. Russia turns to China. 3. China is now heavily involved in the Arctic development projects. Of course, after spending years trying to find an in, China welcomed this opportunity with open arms. With this opportunity also comes access to unprecedented mineral reserves, plentiful energy resources, and crucial maritime routes. Talk about striking gold. Another concession Russia made to China has to do with weapon exports to India. You see, China and India have had their fair share of bloody border disputes. On the Indian side, most of these disputes were fought with Russian weapons, as the country was the #1 arms importer for India for a long time. Beijing did try to get Moscow to cut arms sales to India during this period, but Moscow didn't want to hear it. After all, who is China to dictate who Russia can and can't sell weapons to? Well, the days of asking this prideful question are certainly gone. India has seemingly also taken the hint, slashing its arms procurement from Russia in more than half, much to China's satisfaction. This sentiment has undoubtedly spread to other areas of cooperation between Russia and China, since there's virtually no area where Russia hasn't made some sort of concession. For instance, in October 2023, Russia signed a nearly desperate grain agreement with China to contain Ukraine's exports to the country. The agreement is worth around $25.7 billion and obliges Russia to provide 70 million tons of grain, legumes, and oilseeds over 12 years. This and other humiliating one-sided concessions signal that Moscow is desperate to tether Beijing closer, doing anything it can to retain its favor. Well, for now, at least. But will Russia be able to handle this dynamic for long? Can Putin, a leader driven by unyielding pride, truly be content serving as a compliant puppet to China's strategic ambitions? You probably already know the answer to this question. Sure, Putin is currently in a tough bind. He must take everything he can from China, even if that means Russia is seen as the country's pet. After all, he sees the conflict in Ukraine as central to his fight to keep his regime and confront the US, so being China's pet is currently the lesser of two evils. But Putin has already demonstrated how much he's willing to sacrifice and let his people endure for the sake of neutralizing perceived threats to Russia's sovereignty, so it's highly unlikely Russia will submit to China forever. So despite many reports that Russia has sealed its fate as China's vassal, let's not jump to any conclusions, not when the dependence in this relationship isn't so one-sided, and not when dependence doesn't necessarily equal subservience for Russia. Remember, Russia is still the #1 nuclear power in the world, and it still boasts a rather resilient economy and some strategic advantages that allow it to maintain a degree of autonomy in its dealings with China. Let's break it down. It's undeniable that the war in Ukraine has crippled Russia's economy for a while, but 2 years after the invasion started, it seems that it bounced right back. In 2023, the Russian economy registered a robust growth rate of 3.6%, which came on the heels of a recession in 2022. But even 2022 wasn't as disastrous as predicted. Russia's economy was predicted to shrink by 12%, but only did so by 2.1%. This outcome even confounded the International Monetary Fund, which subsequently revised its forecast for 2024, predicting that the Russian economy might record a 2.6% growth. But how is this possible when several rounds of Western sanctions have been levied against the country? Russia has military spending to thank for this. Producing military equipment has kept the country's factories pretty busy, benefiting all industrial sectors. The revenue from oil and gas exports also helped. Now, you might ask, doesn't China have a hand in both of these areas? The answer is yes, but that's not the only contributing factor. The volume of Russian oil exports to India and a few other developing countries can be comparable to exports to China. Plus, just because China has a major share in Russia's trade doesn't make the country entirely economically dependent. Just take Australia as an example. China has a 26% share in Australia's foreign trade, more than Russia. Yet you don't see Australia making any long-term concessions to China. It's quite the contrary, really. Australia is actually a part of anti-China alliances like AUKUS, a security pact consisting of Australia, the UK, and the US, whose aim is to contain China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region. But let's go back to Russia's resilience. The situation is pretty much the same in the import department as it is in the export department. Countries like Turkey, India, and the United Arab Emirates have had no problems selling sanctioned goods to Russia, ensuring the necessary inflow of goods to the Russian market. Also, we did discuss the many concessions Russia made to China. However, there are many more Russia has refused to make. This includes joining China's flagship project, the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to facilitate trade and investment flows across Asia. Russia also didn't recognize China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. It also refused to allow the relocation of polluting industries into its territory, or unilateral tariff restrictions, or even eliminate visa requirements for Chinese nationals. These moves, or lack thereof, suggest that Russia can still hold its own to some degree when it comes to China. But why isn't China pressing harder, considering Russia's precarious position? It's simple, really. China needs Russia too. After all, China can act as a global peacemaker all it wants, but the fact remains that virtually no other country sees it that way. Instead, most global powers, with the US at the helm, see China as a dangerous threat. And with a hostile US, a disillusioned Europe, and a wary Asia, China doesn't exactly have a surplus of friends on the global stage. So it needs Russia as a counterbalance if it's to achieve its goal of becoming a global and Asian rule setter. Plus, China can use Russia as a case of study of sorts. Let's explain. Beijing has long viewed Western sanctions against China as inevitable. Thanks to the war in Ukraine, the country now has a front-row seat to how these sanctions actually affect the economy of a major power. China gets to see which protective measures are effective and which are not, which methods of response work and which backfire. Then there's also the issue of battle-testing weaponry. You see, China hasn't been involved in an outright war for over 40 years. This means the nation had no chance to test its military equipment and strategies in a real-life scenario, especially against Western adversaries. Russia is doing just that in Ukraine. Since a huge chunk of these weapons has some ties to Russia, the war in Ukraine gives China the chance to see these weapons' durability, performance, and effectiveness in modern conflict against their Western counterparts. This also gives China a chance to gauge which Russian weapons to acquire next. But it's also worth mentioning that Russia's invasion of Ukraine also serves as a cautionary tale to China. As you probably know, China has similar ambitions in regards to Taiwan. However, if the country's military leadership ever thought an invasion of Taiwan would be a swift victory, the situation in Ukraine should probably give them cause to pause. After all, instead of demonstrating that one of the most powerful military forces in the world can easily subdue a smaller neighbor, the invasion of Ukraine showed that military might can crumble in the face of determined resistance. This unexpected outcome can also mean that China has gotten itself tangled with a losing team, and one that doesn't really like to lose at that. So it's going to be interesting to see what the future holds for both Russia and China. For now, we'll ask you, do you see the relationship between Russia and China as a mutually beneficial alliance? Or do you think Russia is currently nothing more than China's junior partner? If so, will the situation change? And when? Has Putin truly maneuvered his country to a dead end, or is there an out? Share all your predictions and opinions in the comment section below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out why China wants to attack Russia, or click this other video instead.